Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Economic Development Board's BIPOC Perspective event. My name is Sheba Person-Whitley. I'm the Executive Director of the Sonoma County Economic Development Board. As we get started, we will have a couple of housekeeping items. I want to let everyone know that we do actually have live Spanish translation provided this morning. And I also want to let everyone know that this will be recorded. And so people who, of course, are not able to watch it right now can watch it later. We will be providing all of that to everyone and making it available again. Want to make sure that everyone has access to this important information. I also really want to start off by thanking our Economic Development Board sponsors. We really would not be able to bring these types of events forward to you without the support of our foundation sponsors. And so we have the Luther Burbank Savings, Redwood Credit Union, Kaiser Permanente, Exchange Bank, PG&E, Certa Health, Bank of Marin, Providence Health, Sonoma Clean Power, North Bay Business Journal, American River Bank, Comcast, Presenti and Brinker, North Bay Association of Realtors, Summit State Bank, Morgan Stanley, and Sonoma County Tourism. Again, I just want to express my deep appreciation and gratitude for all of our sponsors today. I also want to, of course, thank all of you for taking time on an early Wednesday morning to be with us and tuning in to hear from people of color, Black, Indigenous groups as well, and to learn about their perspectives as local business owners. Your willingness to engage in this topic is what is really needed to help build our community together to continue to grow stronger and more resilient. Our program today will include remarks from the Sonoma County Board of Supervisors Chair, Linda Hopkins. We will also have a panel discussion led by Lorez Bailey of CHOP's Teen Center to really focus and hear from our local business owners. And we will have a keynote presentation from Marlene Orozco. She has a unique perspective on the opportunities and impacts that are facing Black, Indigenous, people of color-owned entrepreneurship and businesses. I would also like to make sure everyone is aware that we will have a question and answer session reserved at the end of the program. So the Q&A feature will be available in Zoom as well as Facebook. If anyone has any questions for Marlene throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A feature and we will get to that at the end of the program. I would also like to remind everyone of proper etiquette, and we want to make sure that we are respectful and are not using any sort of inappropriate language or personal attacks. Now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sonoma County Board of Supervisor Chair, Linda Hopkins, for some welcoming remarks. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Director Person-Whitley. And I actually would like to start on a note of gratitude for you and for your leadership in bringing the community together for this, quite frankly, long overdue and unfortunately unprecedented forum. I think that for too long, we have not incorporated equity into our economic development work. And so I just want to say thank you so much for your leadership and for really focusing on that as part of EDB's core work. So thank you, Director Person-Whitley. I also think it's important to start out by owning the challenges that we face in Sonoma County, which is that, quite frankly, Sonoma County is long overdue for a reckoning on equity, and specifically a reckoning on addressing long-standing racial inequities that we see in our community, in our society, and in our economy. I think that inequities have always existed in Sonoma County, and unfortunately, our years of wildfires, floods, and the ongoing pandemic have only exacerbated them. It's one of the reasons that we are very committed at the County of Sonoma to establishing and supporting equity work within and throughout our community. Equitable access to resources and information can make us more resilient and a more empowered community that's better able to withstand the repeat disasters that we have found ourselves in for the past few years. I really fundamentally believe that to achieve equity in our community, we have to do a couple of things. One is to lead, and one, actually, I think which is more important, is to listen. I want to talk a little bit about ways in which the county is attempting to lead by example in equity work. First of all, racial equity and social justice is a priority goal for our 5-year strategic plan. The creation of the Office of Equity, spearheaded by Director Alegria de la Cruz, is a significant step towards that goal. Some of the objectives include fostering a county organizational culture that supports the commitment to achieving racial equity. And already, Director de la Cruz has made tremendous strides in actually creating an equity core team. These are county employees throughout all of our county departments who are actively identifying areas of improvement in the county and working to come up with creative solutions. We're also working on implementing strategies to try to make our county workforce reflect our county demographics across all levels. This is really critical. I really believe that our government needs to look like and to represent the public that we serve. This is a really important way that I think that our community then can see themselves represented in government and also feel like they can join and engage and work with local government. It also provides an opportunity to utilize the diversity and leverage the diversity of our workforce to examine the way that we operate and to provide services from diverse lenses. Another thing that we're working on is ensuring racial equity throughout all of our county policy decisions and service deliveries. This is a very big, tough thing, but our goal is to achieve this and to ensure that no matter where the public is interacting with the county, they'll be provided with the same equitable services. And the idea is to also add another layer of accountability into this. We're also working to engage with community members and stakeholder groups specifically to develop priorities around the topic of racial equity. And this leads me to, I think, the most important point of this brief remark, which is that, we really need to listen. I am one person on a 5-member board of supervisors that is all white. And I think it's very dangerous if we sort of sit at the dais and kind of make decisions on behalf or legislate on behalf of communities of color, when what we really need to do is to sit down and listen to our communities of color and to work to empower their leadership and to follow their lead with respect to what their communities need and want and deserve from their local government. And so that's why I am just so thrilled to be here today, not to spend the whole time talking to you, but actually to spend the whole time soaking this in and really, really listening. So I would encourage everyone listening today to continue to seek out these kinds of opportunities like today's program to learn about these topics and to be an advocate. And I'm really excited to listen today to Sonoma County business leaders share their unique perspectives, the struggles that they have faced as BIPOC business owners, and their advocacy. I'm also very excited to hear today's keynote speaker, Marlene Orozco, present her research on BIPOC entrepreneurs and businesses. So thank you so much, Director Person Whitley, for your work on this. And I'm looking forward to listening to this program this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair Hopkins. We really appreciate your leadership because we agree 100% that equity is a core value of the county and that we all have an opportunity to really lean in on racial equity and broader equity work as well. And I really appreciate your comments on the importance of this to the broader community. I am now going to shift over to our next segment of our program, which is where we get to hear from some of our local business owners. On our panel today, we have Juan Hernandez, Malia Anderson, Jimenez, and Teresita Hernandez. This panel will be moderated by Lorez Bailey. We're so excited to have Lorez here moderating this panel with us. She is the executive director of CHOPS Teen Club. She has over 20 years of experience in implementing and managing youth development programs. She also has an extensive amount of experience working with community development and in the press. She has previously worked for the Press Democrat, the Community Voice, A&G newspaper group, Youth News, and Channel 50. And we're so excited and want to give a huge round of applause and congratulations to Lorez on her new endeavor. She was just recently named the publisher of the North Bay Business Journal. So we are so excited to have this wonderful panel here today, really highlighting some of their experiences as BIPOC entrepreneurs and business owners and community leaders. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Lorez. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Sheba. That was a very nice introduction. I really appreciate it. And I think that Supervisor Hopkins really laid a great foundation for this conversation today. And I'm happy to be able to be here and moderate. So while we know the pandemic has presented economic challenges for everyone, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, small businesses have been among the hardest hit. Already vulnerable, minority-owned independent companies are disproportionately affected by everything going on in these last couple of years, well, this year and a half. And today we're going to be talking to Sonoma County BIPOC-owned businesses who are going to share their own challenges to access, experiences over the last year, and also how they're planning to navigate the road to economic recovery. Our hope for today is that you'll learn more about these unique challenges faced by these business owners, and opportunities to learn, but also how we can advocate for these businesses. And what I want to also say is, in our prior conversations for planning today, not only was I impressed with how these businesses had to shift, and the word that we used a lot is pivot, but also the resourcefulness and also making shifts to support their local community. So as Sheba has already said, our guest today, I'd like to just go ahead and once again say that today we have joining us Juan Hernandez of help me, Juan, let me make sure I say it correctly.
It's Creser.
Thank you. It's very important. You know, part of when we talk about this work is really being sure that we say things and people's names correctly. So that was very important. Malia Anderson of Style by Malia, Osvaldo Jimenez of Noble Folk Ice Cream and Pie Bar, and Teresita Hernandez of La Michoacana. And we are just so happy to have you here today. So let's get started in our conversation. So Malia, why don't you start with telling us what is your professional role and how have your life experiences influenced that work?
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I'm Malia Anderson. I am the founder and owner of Style by Malia. It's a full service wardrobe styling firm and consulting, image and branding consulting firm here in Sonoma County. And I think that my personal life experiences that got me to become an entrepreneur is very simple. My grandmother was an entrepreneur. She's still an entrepreneur. She's almost 90 years old. She still runs a business every single day. And I always wanted to just work for myself. It's the one thing she asked me not to do. She said, do anything in the world but be an entrepreneur. You know, get a job, work for the county, work for the city, do anything but be an entrepreneur. She says, because it's hard work. And I think the last year and a half, the last 3 years actually, have really shown that it is hard work, but if you keep pushing, you can persevere through it.
Ozzy, can you answer that same question? What experiences have influenced your work?
Well, that's a really big question to unpack. Hi, everyone. My name is Ozzy Jimenez. I'm the owner and also founder of Noble Folk Ice Cream. On my other days, I wear the hat as vice mayor of the city of Healdsburg. And I want to give a special shout out to another SLAY alum here in the room, Juan Hernandez. And also really appreciative of Marlene Orozco from the Stanford Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative. Just really excited to be with all you folks today. So in your professional role, how have your life experiences influenced that work? Well, similarly to Malia, you know, my parents were small business entrepreneurs. So they came to this country. My dad was a farm worker, ag worker in the Central Valley. I grew up undocumented here in California. And so immediately, you know, growing up as a child, as an LGBTQ individual, I saw the scarcity of resources for people who look like me. And so there was an incessant need in my family to be able to survive, right? We didn't have, you know, my parents didn't necessarily have the educational background to be able to, you know, hold a master's degree or to be able to, you know, go to a bank, right? And apply for a loan and get approved for a small business. And so for me as a young individual, you know, some of the life experiences that have influenced me is my upbringing. But also I think specific to Sonoma County is just being you know, I'm not native to Sonoma County, but I've lived here my whole entire life. And so I've seen, you know, economic development in this county change over the last 35 years. I've seen the gaps within our communities that are still haven't been met. And I still see the challenges. And so for me, you know, I think a lot of what I first did in my business during the first 10 years was just really focused on my business, growing it, scaling it. And then most recently got involved in nonprofit philanthropy work and as of this past year in civic government. So I'm trying to bring all of those life experiences to see how I can better uplift my community. So thank you all.
Juan?
Hello, everybody. Again, I just want to say thank you for this opportunity to be here today, and for Lorez and Sheba for trying to flip the script. You know, we're trying to flip that script, trying to get different people, different faces on what we're trying to do in the community. Hello, everybody. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Creser Capital. Creser Capital is a startup, nonprofit, and lending investment organization. And we're an emerging community development financial institution, which is a CDFI. We are based on the belief that by partnering with Latino small business owners to provide investment, education, and financial coaching, we can help transform lives, grow economically, and develop a stronger community. I think at the end of the day, Creser is based on the idea that Sonoma County is dependent on the success of the Latino community, Latino small businesses, and people of color. And so that's what Creser is about. And what has influenced me, I think similar my family. I think my abuelitas, my grandmas on both sides of my family, my grandma on my dad's side, she was a midwife. She used to cook, she used to sew. She used to be the neighborhood counselor. And she was an entrepreneur, and she was able to raise 10 kids, buy a house. And we're talking about in the 30s and in the 40s with entrepreneurship. And now I am experiencing, you know, that success that she had. Now I'm experiencing that success for me to be able to go to school, go to college, you know, graduate. Most recently, I was executive director of La Luz Center, where I had a great experience of learning. And so I think the combination, there's a common thread in terms of family entrepreneurship spirit within the family, that we saw that success. And now at this point in my career, I want to be able to spread that to the rest of the community, right? I want to share what I've learned. I want to build a really great organization for the benefit of Sonoma County. Thank you.
And of course, Teresita. You're muted.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be a panelist. I come from my business is Let Me Truck on Ice Cream. I have a fellow ice cream maker here. It started in the 40s from my great-grandfather in a small town, and it's the small town that found its way to an alternative for resources in that small area. And though my father came at a young age to this country, and we lived here till 1975. Since I was young, I was able to go to school here and was able to learn English. And back then, we were the only family, or at least in my school in the Springs and Sonoma area, that we were Latinos at that time. We were the only family in that school, and we then became ambassadors for other families that started coming in. So Sonoma County has changed tremendously from that point on. Returned to Mexico, my dad became a business owner, and that was an opportunity that had through the resources in Mexico, through family and friends. I came back to the States, and then that's where I have my entrepreneurial background from my relatives. Because I was able to live in both cultures, I was able to then engage with the community in my area, with the Latino community, and involved in the facade improvement of the area of Sonoma. It's been amazing, the growth that it has, and also the disparities that I still see from being a Latino, especially in an economically challenged area, which is part of the Springs, because that is where a lot of Latino families live. But I have been able to, because of my experience of entrepreneurial and bridging the gap with the language barrier, education barrier, been able to communicate with a lot of the Latino community businesses and seen how is greatly challenged by racial equality. And in the Latino community specifically, there's a lot of fear because as we know, there's a lot of immigration issues that's present with that community, and that keeps the community back. And it's been my hope to help that and reach out to that community and business in my area.
Thank you. Part of what this conversation is we've been saying is that we know there are unique challenges for BIPOC-owned businesses. So I'm going to start with Malia. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges for BIPOC-owned businesses in Sonoma County, and how has the pandemic exacerbated these challenges?
Thank you so much for the question. I think that the pandemic sort of bursted open challenges that we already had. 2017, the fires sort of devastated a lot of people's businesses. And as we thought we were getting them back together in 2018, we had more fires. And 2019, we sort of said, okay, we're on our way back. And then 2019, at the end of 2019, my business was on a trajectory to go back to where, back to moving and shaking and doing what I do. And then 2020, and it all sort of came to a screeching halt. I think one of the things that people think of when they think of entrepreneurship is, they think entrepreneurs, business owners, the Jeff Bezos of the world. Well, that's great on a grand scale, but small businesses are what make the world go around. If it wasn't for, small service-based businesses, would there be, an opportunity for Jeff Bezos to have risen to where he, is now retired in space and all the things? But that's neither here nor there. But what I'm saying is that as a minority-owned business, as a BIPOC-owned business, as a female-owned business, as a small business, we suffered through the pandemic because we kept opening and closing. When you think about your hairdresser, your massage therapist, your small restaurants, those things kept opening their doors in hopes that people would flood back in, only to then have to shut their doors. As a wardrobe stylist, I can definitely say that my business took a huge hit because everybody was doing this. It's really hard to buy people clothes when everybody only sees you from the neck up. So it wasn't as if there was, an opportunity for me. There were no events, people weren't traveling. So there was no opportunities for me to scale my business or even pivot my business, because my business is a people business. And when people are scared and people are not, going out, then you have to sort of figure it out. And I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, people said, well, you're a business owner, you were prepared for this. Well, yeah, I could keep keep everything going for 4 months. At month 3, I could stretch it to 6 months, but nobody prepared for almost 2 years of this, and we still don't know what's going to happen. We have businesses closing again. We have things shutting down again. Restaurants that can't open for lunch because they don't have employees. People moving out of the state. I mean, I don't know how many of my clients moved out of the state of California. My clients who have decided not to go back to work or who decided to do something different. So I think as BIPOC-owned businesses, what we need, what one of the challenges is that the challenge of unknown and not being able to express express the fear that we have. There were people said, oh, there's PPP loans. Not for me, not for my small business. And I saw larger businesses, take PPP loans and go to Mexico, buy cars, do these things that had nothing to do with those financial needs of small businesses or 1-2 person businesses. I applied for grants. I applied for, community funding. I applied for everything, and it just was not. I wasn't a restaurant. I didn't sell a product. I am my product. So I think that those challenges just keep keep pushing small business owners down. And I know a lot of small business owners and a lot of BIPOC business owners who just got a job. And that saddens me. That saddens me that for 12 years, I have run a successful business in this community. And the thought that, there's no more pivot, we've gone all the way around. Like, what is the next step here? And with this pandemic still looming, around us, I don't know where we're going to be. I just know that we need supports of our community. And that's one thing that we're not asking for, but we're also not seeing.
It's a perfect transition for Ozzy because you own a restaurant. You're, as Malia is saying, that open, close, and then also I'm sure you're dependent on hospitality and that tourism component to the area. So if you could talk a little bit about one of those greatest challenges, and also in the face of a pandemic.
Yeah, thank you, Lorez, and thank you, Malia, for your comments. So what do you see as the biggest challenge for BIPOC businesses in Sonoma County? And then how's the pandemic exacerbated this? Again, another big question to unpack. I think there are a couple of different ways I think I can take this question, but I think the way I'll take this question is kind of relating into the pandemic, kind of in that transition of the existing gaps for businesses in Sonoma County as a young business owner, as a Latinx business owner. There are these gaps that exist that keep us from being able to secure capital to grow and scale our business. So already, small businesses are existing in an ecosystem where there is, specifically Latino-owned businesses, where there is a need for financial literacy. And then that financial literacy is needed in order to secure capital from banks. And so many individuals in the Latino community struggle with that component. And so you layer that component with, what was happening first in the pandemic was a lot of small business owners were being directed to the SBA to apply for EIDL. There was no PPP in the very first early months of the pandemic. And so what we saw was a bottleneck of people who are wanting to apply, who have submitted their applications, and then the federal government lagging and being able to get funds to people. So there was that component. And then there was a component of people who didn't even know how to apply for an SBA loan. And you had people who didn't even know how to apply for a PPP loan. I remember calling banks on behalf of some folks, and they hadn't even developed a PPP loan application yet. So we saw all of the gaps, within the system essentially break down. And, one of my biggest concerns in the community in Sonoma County that I love is all of our really small makers and crafters and creators, that don't have that financial literacy. I was worried about cultural erasure. I was worried about the panaderia, down in Santa Rosa that wasn't going to be able to open, my favorite taco place that wasn't going to be around. And so immediately I got on the phone and contacting individuals saying, how can I help? How can I support you? Because I felt one of the biggest gaps early on in the pandemic was financial literacy. Again, how has the pandemic exacerbated these challenges? I mean, tenfold, just like Malia was saying that we need safe spaces, right? So before the pandemic, if you were a small business owner, the only place to engage from a business development relationship perspective was a chamber. Well, chambers are great and they serve the community and they have their purpose, but also chambers aren't necessarily and historically haven't been inclusionary of LGBTQ people. So, you have all of these gaps, all of these gray areas where people like me don't necessarily fit in the box. And then we have to deal with the challenges that we face on a day-to-day without the layer of a pandemic. And so it was just a really compounding problem. And we're still seeing the effects. We're still seeing small businesses not being able to open up again. We're still seeing families not being able to support we still have the COVID response, and so I think the importance here is for small businesses to remain focused, remain positive, but talk to each other. I think that's kind of the best thing that I saw happen for small businesses is you had different sectors of industry talking to each other where that necessarily hadn't really existed before. There's this inherent kind of, need for competition in whatever industry you're in. And what I saw most of the pandemic was people just collaborating, talking. Yes, people were pivoting, but they were pivoting together. What works for you? What doesn't work? So yeah, that would be my answer to that question. Thank you.
Thank you. Juan, I'm going to come to you because I think this question really comes to what you're trying to do and the work that you're talking about in terms of building sustainability, but support for BIPOC businesses. So what do you see as some of the greatest opportunities to address the needs that Ozzy and Malia have talked about, and what assets or creative solutions can we leverage to address adversity?
I think what happened with George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement gave a spotlight to the continued need for social justice in Sonoma County. But you cannot have social justice without economic justice. We're talking about what Malia was talking about, we're talking about Ozzy's talking about. There's these gaps within our system that need to be fixed. When people of color in Sonoma County have 1/8 of the wealth as the white counterparts in Sonoma County, that's a problem. And when Latino and people of color cannot access capital because of the institutional racism or the lack of understanding how it works, either because of the language or relationships, what good is social justice if we're still locked out of the economic opportunities? And I think that's what Creser is trying to set, is a platform for people of color, Latino small businesses to be able to have that organization that could reach to that level. Ozzy was talking about the PPP loans and Malia was talking about the PPP loans. I remember we were trying to help people apply for PPP loans. And what happened was they didn't have a relationship with any bank. They had maybe an ATM, but they didn't know any bankers. And a lot of times those bankers were the access points for a lot of these PPP loans. And a lot of the small businesses that we were trying to help, they had no relationship. So I think that one of the things that really needs to happen is it's basically the same issues that were there before, which is access to capital. And a lot of times people don't understand that banks need to use the same amount of time that a $100,000 loan or a $1 million loan, it's the same amount of time and money to do a $10,000 or a $20,000 loan. So guess what banks are gonna do? They're gonna go for the $1 million or the $100,000 loan because there's probably more interest over the long run than waste their time on a $10,000 or a $15,000 loan into the community. We averaged about 30 touches per loan to Latino small entrepreneurs. That's 30 touches. That's conversations, that's meetings, an email, a call. That's 30 touches that a bank doesn't want to do. They want to just assess your FICO score, see if you have your finances ready to go, if you have a relationship with that bank, and that business most likely will get that loan. But if somebody, a small business, a taco guy from Roseland, he may not even have a permit. There's a lot of obstacles that happen to our Latino small businesses, and it stops them from getting that access to capital. I think number two is the idea of business development, understanding like your finances, your marketing of the business. A lot of times our Latino business owners don't have the time to be able to go and take some of these classes, right? So they're just working so much. And then the third thing that needs to happen is the network. Right? How do Latinos access these networks? I used to be part of Rotary, and I remember those first 30 minutes, all you heard was, this house is selling, that business is closing. All those little bits of information that these people used to pass to each other. I hardly see that within the Latino community or people of color. There's not those spaces where you get that information, right? It's that good old boy network, right? It works. It's a network because it works. we need to start building our own networks within the Latino community and people of color to be able to pass the little bits of information that is going to help us, our business grow. So access to capital, knowledge of business development, and supportive networks for our Latino and people of color. I think that if we focus on those three things, I think that, and we have investments in those three things from organizations, I think that will help us come out and accelerate the post-pandemic economy here in Sonoma County.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Teresita and Malia next. And, you know, one of the things that I said that impressed us in our pre-conversations is how resourceful the shifts that we have to make. I think naturally, as people of color, that's a resiliency we have built in just in, you know, the mere existence. But I want to ask you, Teresita, how you think that we can continue to inspire people in Sonoma County to pursue creative solutions and support one another in adversity? Muted.
For me, it appears that it starts at a grassroots level, coming together as a community first, because there's a lot of need for trusting the system. And there's a lot of fear from not having the knowledge and the, you know, the disparities that Ozzy was talking about, computer literacy, financial literacy. So it becomes overwhelming. And this, particularly for the Latino culture, they seem to just hide because they're trying to do their own thing. So there's a lot of separation with that. There isn't a strong cohesive coming together as particularly the business community. That's what I see. But I think it's grassroots, getting people together in a friendly type of way where you're gatherings and then start speaking. I believe that it becomes intimidating if there's a meeting or there's a Zoom. It's really hard to reach that community, particularly the Latino community, that are busy trying to just put food on the table and figure things out. But it's building trust. The Economic Development Board has done a really good job. It was my guiding light to navigate certain things. So they're great, but I noticed that there was very little people joining into their Zoom meetings, and there still is. And it's very sad because they had a lot of good information, a lot of good to offer. But when you have a pandemic where we become even more isolated, that is a challenge. So, and yet we can't really come together in groups right now, in celebration or in community right now, so we can feel safe with one another. It's a connection, it's the human interaction and connection. And like you were saying, in the Rotary, like Juan was saying in the Rotary, that's its own way, but with our community of color, we need to feel safe. We need to feel at home. And for some, it's very intimidating, the language barrier, their immigration status, all that becomes like, no, I need to hide because I can't raise, any light on me because I'm hiding over here because I'm getting by, I'm not legal. There's a lot of fear. And so, yes, it's when we're able to come together and then share with one another, then create that from a very basic level. That's the way I see how it could build up from there, those steps. But the Economic Development Board was extremely helpful to help us navigate during those times and how to go through the PPP and all that. But we were on our own. And banks, corporate banks, I do have a relationship with my bank, but because it's so corporate, I'm sorry, you need to call this number, or you could do it online. There were banks that were small, banks that are small that were really reaching out and being helpful, but not the big corporate banks that are just looking at the bottom line. Like Juan was saying with finances, they don't care. They're looking for big bucks.
So Teresita, it sounds like we're talking about, access to information,
Mhm.
inclusion, community.
Mhm.
All of these things are important. And so, our time is kind of wrapping up, but just really quickly, if I could have just, briefly, Teresita, since I have you here, what is just something that you are encouraged or hopeful about?
The resilience of the human spirit continuing, and that there's programs that I'm seeing right now that Juan has created, like Creser, which means to grow, and what has come out of this pandemic, the light that has been shed in the disparities, that it's going to create a movement to really focus on that. It's kind of like the Floyd issue, bringing light to social justice in that area. It's that these are opportunities to shed more light into and what we're doing here, what you're presenting here. This is what that looks like, and that gives hope that out of the ashes, new life and new light will come out, where all these things have existed for a long time. It just brought a magnifying glass. So I'm hopeful that renewed energy to do it better, make it better.
Well, I just want to thank all of you for your time today and your introspection and what we've learned in this time. And, it's a lot of hope, just hearing what you have to say. And I hope that people have learned about the unique experiences being a BIPOC business in Sonoma County, and just really appreciate your time today and really giving us an opportunity to learn more about the challenges that have been this last year, but also there's positivity and there's hope looking at the road to recovery in the next few months and beyond. So thank you so much for your time today. And thank you to the Economic Development Board for really putting this topic and this, because, this is something we could do a whole week on this topic. This could be a whole entire day, but thank you for this snapshot. And Sheba, thank you for putting this forward today for our community.
Thank you so much, Lorez, and thank you for this wonderful discussion and the panelists for giving your time and sharing your experiences. So huge thank you to Lorez, Juan, Malia, Ozzy, and Teresita. So before we shift over to our keynote speaker today, who is Marlene Orozco, I want to remind everyone that the Q&A feature is available. If you have any questions during Marlene's presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A feature, and we will try to answer all of those questions at the conclusion of her presentation. So I'm so excited to have Marlene Orozco be our keynote economist today. She really has a huge wealth of experience and knowledge really on BIPOC and minority-owned business and entrepreneurship. She is the lead research analyst at the Stanford Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative at Stanford University. She has a BA with honors in sociology from Stanford and a master's degree in education policy and management from Harvard University. She is also a PhD candidate, and it is our understanding that she will receive her PhD in 2 weeks in sociology. So huge congratulations. That is a massive accomplishment. Also, just want to say that Marlene has this wonderful, experience and is also currently working on an impact study related to minority-owned businesses and the ongoing and immediate impacts of COVID-19. She's been featured in over 100 media outlets, including Bloomberg, MarketWatch, Forbes, NBC News, CNN, and Univision. So without further ado, because I could go on and on and on about her huge list of accomplishments and expertise, I'm going to turn it over to Marlene Orozco. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Sheba Person Whitley and Alina Decker, Board of Supervisors, and the broader Sonoma County Economic Development Board for extending an invitation to be here, and as well to Marco Suarez for making the introduction and championing both our research and education efforts at the Stanford Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative, which we call SLAY for short. Let me go ahead and make sure that my slides are up. There we go. So before I get started into inundating you all with data, I'd love for us to take a moment to engage in a mini exercise. So if you'd like, you can go ahead and close your eyes. And I'd like for you to think about the word entrepreneur. And as you think about this word entrepreneur, what comes to mind? Who comes to mind? What industries are you thinking about? And lastly, are you an entrepreneur? You can go ahead and open your eyes. If you did so, close them. And as you think about those images and thoughts, I would love for you to hold them in your mind throughout our discussion today. Perhaps you thought about Malia or Juan or Ozzy or Teresita. And I'm so grateful to come after them because they certainly really laid the foundation for a lot of the topics that we're going to cover today. So on this notion of an entrepreneur, a dictionary search of this term describes an entrepreneur as follows: a person who organizes and operates a business or businesses, taking on greater than normal financial risks in order to do so. And you can see there a series of synonyms that are related to entrepreneurship. A businessman, right? So there's some gender terms, although there also includes businesswoman, a business person, and then this last group, more kind of active, mover and shaker, go-getter, a high flyer, a hustler. Now, if we take Malia's imagery that she invoked earlier on, oftentimes when people think about an entrepreneur, they think about Jeff Bezos, they think about Mark Zuckerberg. And the reality, as you all have heard, is that the nation's economic backbone is built on small businesses, and increasingly so on BIPOC business owners, which you'll hear all about in just a bit. Now, if we think about academic literature on entrepreneurship, there's a real dichotomy that's presented. And entrepreneurship is oftentimes depicted as a necessity-driven or opportunity-driven. And this framework was really presented as a push and pull framework. For necessity entrepreneurs, you're pushed into entrepreneurship because you're low skilled, you lack employment, and you're on the whole unable to compete in the formal labor market. You're an opportunity-driven entrepreneur if you seek to innovate, if you find an opportunity in a market and seek to take advantage of that. But seldom are these two taken together when we think about BIPOC entrepreneurs. In fact, the literature has largely depicted BIPOC entrepreneurs as largely, if not singularly, necessity-driven. But as I note here, our social systems are really complex. And they sometimes involve competing logics on what entrepreneurs are and what their motivations are, and also how we define success. So some of these logics are rooted in family, in community, in profession. And historically, success for entrepreneurship is largely driven by economic factors. And in fact, most of what I'll show you today will be based in economics, right? So revenue, profit making. But it's really important for us to keep in mind that those are not the only markers of success, and that we should look towards entrepreneurs and the way that they are driven and motivated and also defining their own successes. On this notion of necessity-driven entrepreneurship, as I mentioned, the literature tends to almost conflate BIPOC entrepreneurs with necessity and overwhelmingly having low stocks of capital. There's this really popular study on the economic lives on the poor by Banerjee and Duflo. And they describe if you have few skills and little capital, being an entrepreneur is often easier than finding an employer with a job to offer. You buy some fruits and vegetables or some plastic toys at a wholesaler's and start selling them on the street. You make some extra dosa mix and sell the dosas in front of your house. You collect cow dung and dry it to sell it as fuel. You attend to one cow and collect the milk. These types of activities are exactly those in which the poor are involved. Now, I think a lot of this is largely based in this dichotomous of, developed countries versus, third world. That's a pejorative term, but less developed countries. But the reality is, as you just heard from our entrepreneurship panel, is that BIPOC community members have long, deep-rooted histories of entrepreneurship, and perhaps they engaged in some of these activities. But today I want to kind of demystify some of these misconceptions about BIPOC entrepreneurs today. So who are BIPOC entrepreneurs? The term BIPOC really came into our lexicon in the last decade or so with a recent surgence, and it's meant to acknowledge the distinct experience of Black and Indigenous people, and also people of color. So we know that colorism is real. There are real impacted and disparate outcomes on the basis of skin tone and other phenotypic characteristics. Studies have showed this time and time again. There's also a unique history of slavery for Black Americans that the nation is grappling with. And then of course, for Indigenous populations, the nation was built through colonization. So that comes with its own unique and distinct experiences. This term is also meant to move away from more pejorative terms like minority and marginalized. And in the cases that I use either term, it's really based on the nomenclature of the data in which I'm pulling from. And I think, it's important to talk about naming and ensure that we're all on the same page here, but I also don't want it to take away from the topic at hand. And as I mentioned, the literature again, and perhaps even popular media has largely conflated BIPOC entrepreneurs as largely necessity driven and having low stocks of capital. But one thing that I hope that you all take away, not just from the panelists, but from this talk, is that there are real opportunities for intergenerational mobility through entrepreneurship. And I'll highlight that for you today. So on this notion of this economic development potential of BIPOC-owned businesses, we have seen an exponential increase in higher education in the last few decades. So historically, Black Americans in the country were largely majoring in education in the 1960s, but in the 1970s, we saw a shift and the number of business majors rose substantially, not just for Black Americans, but also for Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans, as shown in this table here. So there's been a real shift, which also indicates a shift in opportunities. Historically, we saw for Black Americans, careers in education as the basis of their degrees. So teachers, we also saw preachers. But again, there's been this movement towards business degrees, which is also a reflection of larger patterns. As this figure here shows you, here are the trends over 2 decades long worth of self-employment across the United States. And that green trend line is the percentage of US self-employment among the white population, which has been on a historical decline. And then you can see the increasing trends down below of entrepreneurship among BIPOC communities. Over the last 10 years alone, for instance, the number of Latino-owned businesses has grown 44% compared to just 4% for all others. Now, a lot of my research focuses on Latino business owners by virtue of my work at Stanford Graduate School of Business, leading the research at Stanford Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative. But again, it's important to keep in mind these larger trends of other BIPOC groups as well. And if, as we're thinking about economic recovery and rebuilding, certainly from natural disasters in Sonoma County, Latinos absolutely play an important impact in that recovery. If we think about the last economic recession, the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, there actually would have been fewer businesses after the recession in 2012 compared to before the recession, were it not for Latinos starting new businesses. So again, all trends are pointing towards exponential growth, really, of BIPOC business owners, and we can expect these trends to continue in the future. Now, I also want to note that a lot of this growth is actually driven by women. So here you can see a bar graph of just women entrepreneurs in the state of California. And over the last 5 years where we have data available, the number of Latina-owned businesses grew 12%. It grew 1% for Black women and 15% for Asian women. And you can see here that similar to the larger historical trends, the number of businesses owned by white women has declined in California. And really, it's important to think about this intersectional lens of gender and race and ethnicity as we think about policies moving forward on a segmented basis to really focus and hone in on those groups that have been the largest hit. We recently did a study this past year on the ongoing impact of COVID-19. I'll talk all about ongoing impacts of COVID-19 in just a bit, but I do want to highlight there that women in particular, Latinas, were one of the hardest hit groups. They were more likely to experience, twice as likely to experience business closure, had competing interests of having to run school districts at home with children learning from home and taking on a greater share of domestic responsibilities. And for entrepreneurs, also trying to navigate resource allocation for their businesses. And so these effects are compounded. And so certainly we can think about recovery as being a compounding effort as well. Now, I want to spend some time thinking about employer firms in particular. If we think about business ownership as an asset similar to home ownership, then it's really important for us to consider trends and opportunities around employer firms. Now, an employer firm is a business with at least one paid employee other than the business him or herself. Now, for most BIPOC-owned businesses, they are actually non-employer businesses. Roughly 20%, it varies by segment, but roughly 20% of businesses are employer businesses. And these businesses generate greater revenue, and they also employ other people. And so we see them as job creators. And so again, it's important to think about what their growth has been. And this figure here shows you specifically for Latinos in California, what the number of employer firms are. There's about 84,000 across the state, which seems like not a lot, but together they generate $121 billion in revenue for the state of California. And so it's important to, again, continue to track that growth. We've seen, that they're together for Latinos, 11.4% of all employer firms are Latino. And so again, measuring this over time will be critical, not just for understanding recovery and impact of the pandemic, but also longer term notions of wealth creation in the Latino community. Now, as we engaged in the exercise early on, and I asked you to think about who an entrepreneur is, and also what industries they're located in, I think oftentimes misconceptions might lead us to believe that BIPOC business owners are located in a single industry. And the reality is that we're seeing growth across virtually all industries, specifically for Latinos, but these trends hold across other BIPOC communities as well. And so here you can see this figure that shows you above the blue trend line, those are industries where Latinos saw greater growth on average in employer businesses. And this is really important to think about as we think about ongoing policies, particularly one related to infrastructure, right? So, California stands to receive upwards of $25 billion over the next 5 years. And as you can see in this figure here, Latinos are over-indexing in construction and transportation and warehousing. And so it's going to be really important that local governments and state governments think about representation and who gets awarded those contracts. I certainly have a ton more to say about contract and procurement opportunities, and so we'll get to that in just a bit. And This slide here talks a little bit more about employer firms in terms of the jobs that they've been creating. So this table here shows the number of jobs in thousands of workers. And you can see here that for African-American, Asian-American, and Latino-owned firms, the number of jobs created has grown exponentially since 2012. So you can see the percent change in that last category, with Asian Americans having grown 99%, in jobs between 2002 and 2016. And we see kind of similar, very high rates for other groups. And so job creation, certainly key for BIPOC-owned businesses. Another figure that I want to show in terms of economic development and perhaps demystifying notions of BIPOC businesses is revenue growth. So one measure of revenue is conducting an analysis of compound annual revenue growth. So this is looking at revenue year over year. And here we have it on a 2-year basis and a 5-year basis. This is just looking at Latino-owned businesses in California compared to white-owned businesses, and then also nationally as well. And this is done as a matter of current data limitations, but it paints a picture nonetheless. And it shows you here that over a 2-year period, Latino-owned businesses in California are actually outgrowing their revenue, or growing their revenue at a faster rate relative to white-owned businesses. And so again, this is doing much to demystify who we think these businesses are and kind of what their potential growth is. Now, it's important to note that over a 5-year period, we see some stagnation in revenue growth. And there is 2 hypotheses as to why this could be. One, Latino-owned businesses are younger on average than white-owned businesses, 10 versus 14 years respectively. But also there's a ton of challenges related to accessing capital. And we heard from the entrepreneurs themselves about what some of those challenges were. And I will certainly dig in just a bit, elaborating on those challenges, accessing capital. Now at SLAY, we conducted a thought experiment because part of our work is really pushing and making an economic argument for supporting Latino-owned businesses. This is not to discredit or disregard social and moral arguments. Those are valid reasons why people should be interested in BIPOC business owners broadly. But it's also, again, a very real economic impact. If we think about scaling the current number of Latino-owned businesses just in the state of California, and they were to generate on average what their non-Latino counterparts generate, there would be an additional $451 billion added to the state of California. And so again, very real opportunities here. All trends point towards continued growth. Now let's think about how communities, local governments can come together to support the scaling of these businesses. Now, one of the questions that I think is important for us to think about as we thought about this dichotomous relationship of necessity-driven versus opportunity-driven entrepreneurship, and one of the things to close the loop there is that entrepreneurship can be both. It needs not be just opportunity or necessity-driven. An entrepreneur can start a business, and many of them did actually in the pandemic out of necessity. Maybe they were laid off, maybe they were interested in doing something else. And so out of that is born a business. And so one can codify that as being driven out of necessity, but then you can actually grow and build it and see opportunities in the market and make contributions in a way that allows for a scalable and growth prospects of your business. So a question that I want us to think about is entrepreneurship a pathway for mobility? And up front, I told you, yes, it was. And Secretary Yellen, when she was at the Federal Reserve Bank a few years ago, she gave a really famous speech where she talked about entrepreneurship as being one of the building blocks of economic opportunity in the United States. The other building blocks are resources for children, affordable higher education, business ownership, and inheritances. And so we looked at SLAY, we looked at 3 kind of prominent features that contribute to an overall person's financial well-being. These include their income. This includes a kind of a prototypical asset like owning a home, so home ownership. And the third one is health insurance. Because we live in a country where health insurance is a very costly expense. It's important to fold that in to a person's financial well-being, because oftentimes we are one kind of looming tragedy away from, in many cases, economic bankruptcy. And certainly many folks are experiencing the compounding effects of that with COVID as a health crisis, compounding into an economic crisis as well. And so this figure here shows you for a number of racial and ethnic groups, what the distribution is across income for those who are entrepreneurs, which is the first bar, compared to those who are non-entrepreneurs or wage workers. And across most measures, certainly across home ownership and income, you can see that being an entrepreneur affords you greater degrees of flexibility and freedom on income and home ownership. Where we see some important gaps is in health insurance. Health insurance is very costly still for those who are self-employed. And so that is something to think about as we expand our discussion on safety nets. And certainly, I think many of you all are already well versed in this, but it's important to note here as well about the health impacts of COVID-19, again, also compounding for economic impacts, and really how BIPOC communities have experienced the brunt of the health of COVID-19. It is indiscriminate in terms of who gets, who contracts COVID-19, but nonetheless, we're seeing an increased amount of cases among a number of BIPOC communities, with indigenous populations experiencing the greatest hospitalization rates and death rates, as depicted here on this figure. And so again, if we think about business ownership, households, wealth generation, contracting COVID can really be debilitating for families and certainly for communities. So it's important to keep those impacts in mind as we continue to talk about the economic impacts of COVID. So I started to talk a little bit about the lower rates of health insurance coverage among self-employed individuals across racial and ethnic groups relative to wage working counterparts. And that's largely because in the United States, we have an employer-based health insurance system. And there actually has been a study that shows that having a system set up this way actually discourages entrepreneurship and new business creation. So these safety nets are very important to think about how we want to continue to grow local economies. So health insurance plays a key role in decision-making for entrepreneurs. There are other employer-based benefits like retirement plans, which may also have an important impact. Certainly, future research studies can consider this. There's a new CalSavers program that went into effect. And this program, took 10 years in the making from a number of advocacy groups, Unidos US being one of them. And this CalSavers program mandates all employer businesses with more than 5 employees to provide retirement benefits to their employees. Now, this comes through this program at no cost to the employer, but the employer needs to register. So if you are in the audience and you're an employer business of at least more than 5 employees, consider checking out the CalSavers program, disseminate the word. I recently learned about it, and I think it's very important for those employer businesses, certainly in California, to know about this, but also self-employed individuals. So even if you have no employees and you're thinking about taking the risk and starting a business, but don't want to lose your retirement package at your current employer, consider looking into this CalSavers program as a possibility for you. And another component of the safety net that was really illuminated throughout our experience of the pandemic has been the role of stimulus checks. There's been lots of talk around universal basic income and what that may do for people. And there's been a research study that actually shows a rise in business registrations coinciding with federal stimulus checks, and it is the strongest in Black communities. So at the start of the pandemic, we saw kind of a real screeching halt of businesses with business closures, but kind of I think contradictory in some ways for some people is this rise that we've actually seen in across mostly states on the East Coast where this study was conducted. And again, this is largely attributed to or associated, I shouldn't say attributed, but associated with the ongoing stimulus checks, but also unemployment benefits as well. There was a story that came out in the New York Times of Pilar Donnelly, who is an entrepreneur based in Houston. She was laid off from her job at the start of the pandemic and took up this hobby of building play structures for her 2 6-year-old boys. And then she thought, she was getting requests from family members and community members to build play structures. So she converted this into a business. Now, she is the owner of Wish You Would Custom Creations. And here, it was really powerful that she said, it feels significant that we saw this big response in neighborhoods where it doesn't typically happen. When you remove those gateways that have worked in some ways to limit access for certain communities, then you really do unleash potential, right? So you see in these historical trends of entrepreneurship, it's not the case that white males are more inclined or have higher ability to be entrepreneurs, right? That is rather equitably distributed in human populations. It's really a matter of opportunity structures. And so we saw this case, we saw this very clearly with Pilar's story and many others as well. Now, I want to be conscious of time and there's still a ton more to cover. And for all of those viewing, I will absolutely share my slides with you. There's a ton of data to dig in. I want us to spend some time thinking about Sonoma County. This figure here shows you pre-pandemic trends. And again, it's going to be really important as we measure economic recovery and rebuild local economies, that we look at what were the trends prior to the pandemic. And of course, Sonoma County has experienced a number of natural disasters prior to the pandemic. And so that's something that we need to keep in mind as well. But in 2019, there were 60,450 small businesses in Sonoma County. This includes employer and non-employer alike. And roughly, in 2012, roughly 18% of businesses were minority owned. This has likely increased to about a quarter, or 1 out of every 4 businesses in Sonoma County being BIPOC-owned. And again, this trend will likely rise in the future. So it's important that we have a good sense of who they are and where they're going. So I want to highlight very quickly some persistent challenges that we've seen with BIPOC community members prior to COVID-19, which, as the panelists again really alluded for us, have been exacerbated by the pandemic. So, prior to the pandemic, access to capital was an immense challenge for all small businesses, but here this figure shows you kind of the greater instances, to the greater degree in which this is a negative factor for Black owned and Latino owned businesses, the green bars there relative to the white bars. And really these financing challenges are, from in the financing pipeline from beginning to end. There have been audit studies that show, when secret shoppers, right? So folks who go into a bank establishment pretending to be a business owner, as either a Black business owner or a white business owner. And this study shows that the Black business owners are shown different products, oftentimes more costlier products. They're asked different questions. They're questioned about their business registration and go on a whole series of legitimizing their business before they even get to kind of an exchange, a transactional exchange in financing products. So I encourage you all to take some time to look at that fascinating study, which again talks very concretely about the differences in which Black owned businesses and white owned businesses are treated at the moment of inquiry at a bank. And there are several opportunities where implicit bias might be introduced into the financing system. Traditional lending criteria, pretty commonly established as the 5 C's, and these C's are used to determine credit worthiness. The 3 primary ones are capacity, capital, and collateral. So capacity, whether the owner can pay back the loan; the capital, what the borrower has available; collateral, what physical assets the owner can offer up. And then there are 3 others that are oftentimes folded in and packaged depending on which first three are selected. These are conditions, credit, and one I want us to pay attention to is character. And again, this is where, some of these biases may creep in because the characteristics of the business owner are taken into account. Their personal integrity, their good standing, their overall trustworthiness. And there's a number of studies that show on stereotyping and status characteristics, right? If somebody is an immigrant, how they may be automatically codified as illegal or undocumented, even though that may or may not be the case. And so again, important to think about our systems in place and how we can assure kind of more equitable engagement. And for our study, one of the things that I think perhaps was one of the most striking findings was that the odds of being approved by a national bank, if you are Latino, are 60% lower. This is even if we control for business revenue, profitability, and the credit scores of the owner, there's this immense gap. And so it's our work now as community members to think about where it is that gap is being created. I'll go ahead and skip this in the interest of time. I do want to share that, some of these challenges are certainly externally and structurally faith-imposed, but some of them come internally. And there's great work that's being done at the Stanford Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative Education Scaling Program to shift mindsets. There's a powerful activity that's done where Professor Jerry Porras asks entrepreneurs to close their eyes and think about where they want their business to be in 5 years. And then in terms of revenue, and then he asks you to double it or even triple it. And that's what you should be seeking. So these are internal challenges that BIPOC community members may impose on themselves. So not soliciting funding because they may be risk averse or they may have an aversion to debt. They may think that they may not be approved, so they're not even going to try because it is time consuming. Or in many cases, they decided that costs would be too high and these products are perhaps not worth it for them at that point in time. Now, I said I wanted to revisit this, and I think it's really important that we do spend some time talking about the economic development opportunities through procurement, but also the role that this serves for growth of businesses. We conducted a growth framework, and we found that if a Latino-owned business in particular, but this actually holds true for Black-owned and Asian-owned businesses as well. If they have the government or a corporation as a client, they are more likely to grow their business. So this really contributes to the growth and scale of BIPOC-owned businesses. And we saw that it also encourages entrepreneurship. So this is important to think about. And right now the corporations are outspending governments at all levels, local, state, and federal, even though the U.S. Government is the largest contractor and provider of receiving of goods and services in the world, right? So they are the largest purchaser. And so there's an important increase that can happen there. And as we think about policies down the pipeline, ensuring equitable representation among BIPOC groups and securing being able to compete for those contracts will be key. Okay. I can't see my chat feature here. So if I'm running out of time, somebody please feel free to chime in. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep plowing ahead. Okay, great. So now I want to talk very briefly about some of the ways in which these persistent and historical challenges have been really compounded, exacerbated by the pandemic, and for many, they have been brought to light. And so, we talked very early on about how at the start of the pandemic, the number of BIPOC-owned businesses experiencing closure was rapid and immediate. So you can see there the distribution of businesses experiencing closure in April, and then later on the earliest bar graph there in June. We saw an uptick more recently in businesses reopening. Of course, this has to do with local ordinances, but with the uncertainty of the Delta variant, businesses are still having issues with supply chain. Labor has been also an important looming issue. And so these are all things to keep in mind. You'll see lots of figures that show growth and closure in flux. And that's just, it speaks to kind of the unknown nature of the period that we're in. And I heard some of that sentiment echoed by the entrepreneurs as well. They also talked about their experiences with PPP. The payroll protection program was meant for businesses that have employees on payroll. So if you're a self-employed individual, then the PPP was not directed towards you. And unfortunately, most of the businesses in the BIPOC community are non-employers, and so they were already excluded from the PPP. In initial waves, the ways in which BIPOC entrepreneurs do business, they were also excluded because our research has shown that large national banks and to a lesser degree local banks weren't getting these funds to BIPOC entrepreneurs. This figure here comes from a research study from last year that shows you the institutions that were likely to provide funding to Black-owned businesses. The next figure is for Latino-owned, and then I also have one for Asian-owned. But one of the things that I want you to take away is that the top 5 institutions that were providing businesses to BIPOC-owned entrepreneurs or providing loans were credit unions, CDFIs, community development financial institutions, even though they play they have a small footprint in the ecosystem, but were providing larger, kind of larger engagement of BIPOC loans. Nonprofits, minority development institutions, and fintech also played a very key role in terms of being able to distribute PPP funding to Black-owned businesses. You can see the distribution here for Latino-owned businesses, and then here for Asian-owned businesses. Now, one of the key things that I want you all to take away from that particular experience of the PPP was the role of mission-driven banks. So we heard Juan Hernandez and his venture of starting Creser Capital. There's an absolutely need to have those 30 touch points for BIPOC entrepreneurs. And so these are mission-driven banks that are really playing an important role in transforming the lives of underserved citizens and communities, not just pre-pandemic times, but were key during the pandemic as well, and will continue to play an outsized role in the future. As of March of this year, there were 142 minority depository institutions with 1,400 branches, and there are 172 CDFI banks with over 950 branches. And so again, a small kind of footprint in the ecosystem today, but something to look out for in the future. Now I want to share that we conducted a focus group at SLAY in March of 2021. And here we heard from entrepreneurs through a number of industries. So accommodation and food services, professional services, construction, automotive, and arts and entertainment. Of course, there were distinct challenges across industries as a result of COVID-19. But in those conversations, their personal experiences echoed what we see at a larger national scale in terms of trends and numeric data. And so their conversations all revolved around regional banks, smaller banks, really being key and being able to access PPP funding, and also having prior experience with the SBA. It is something that one needs to learn how to navigate. And so if you didn't have prior experience, it was very daunting. And of course, language issues can play barriers there as well. And also legal status, right? These are government loans. And so if you're undocumented, then you are not available to tap into government funding. But of course, there's opportunities through grants and elsewhere. Now, it was really interesting that, again, of these high revenue, I should note that they were high revenue businesses, they were noting that they had, long-standing relationships with large national banks, but they were not being responsive to their needs. And so again, this makes me think about Juan Hernandez's point about, the level of engagement for providing a significantly large business with, a PPP relative to a smaller business. Attention was diverted elsewhere, and you can certainly see that with the experiences of the entrepreneurs. But I do want to note that in these conversations, despite these negative challenges with accessing relief aid and navigating the ever-changing system, there was an overwhelming sense of resilience. And I think that this has been a term that was echoed on the entrepreneur panel. And they reflected very positively on what the pandemic has allowed them to do. It did provide them some time for pivoting, right? We heard that with the group as well. Resourcefulness was another term that kept coming up. Folks were able to have some breathing room for their employees, for those who were working 14-hour days, running events. Their team could rest, could find some time to rest, and then also the owner can engage in some long-term strategizing. And then this last point here is the overwhelming communication from Latinx entrepreneurs talking about them giving back to their communities and finding opportunities to do so despite experiencing challenges themselves. One last thing I'll note, because I see that we're popping up here, is the role of networks. I think that this was also echoed by the entrepreneur. Super critical in terms of being able to access PPP, being able to come into contact with capital providers, get connected to an organization. You know, chambers of commerce have been the traditional business organizations. There's also trade associations, there's education programs, there's, you know, the EDB. There are a number of organizations that are working really, really hard to streamline and synthesize the ever-changing information. So get connected if you're an entrepreneur to an organization, because it will be key in your ongoing trajectory. One final thing. You know, my comments today were not largely harnessed in the experiences of Sonoma County entrepreneurs. I would love to follow up with particulars for entrepreneurs in Sonoma County, but in order to do that, we need some data. And so we started gathering surveys from business owners in Sonoma County. To date, we have a little less than 100, you know, and half of them are white business owners and half of them are Latinx business owners. I encourage all business owners to take this survey. It is about a 15-minute survey. We are conducting research at a university, so we don't sell your information. And it's important in order to understand what your experiences have been and how policies can be directed specifically to address your ongoing challenges. And so again, I'll share this information with you all. Similar to the census, it's important to get counted, have your voice counted, and your experiences considered in the policymaking process. So I will pause there now and see if you all have questions. And thanks again for engaging.
Thank you so much, Marlene. We really appreciate your insightful presentation, really highlighting some of the disparate impacts that we are seeing with BIPOC business owners and entrepreneurs, but also highlighting pathways towards recovery. So very, very appreciative of your time and your expertise. And I also want to echo something Marlene just said. Please, please, please take the survey. This survey is really a partnership between the EDB, United Way of the Wine Country, and the City of Santa Rosa. We really do want to understand and be able to highlight and draw comparisons on what are the impacts of COVID-19 and how those have disproportionately impacted businesses of color. So without further ado, we do have just a few minutes for a couple of questions. I just want to highlight that there have been multiple comments that really support and echo a lot of this call of access to capital, particularly supporting a CDFI. So I want to highlight that there have been multiple comments where people have really shown their support for what Juan Hernandez is attempting to do and really launching this new CDFI, and how critically that is important that's going to be to our BIPOC business owners as we really address access to capital here locally. Also, there is a question from Ozzy. So one of our panelists has a question for you, Marlene. He wants to know, how are undocumented folks, how do they fit into the survey data?
That's a really great question. So we don't ask about undocumented status. We do ask about, you know, whether the entrepreneur is foreign born, whether their parents are foreign born, and whether their grandparents are foreign born. And through that, you know, in the past, we've been able to do, in particular, a DACA comparable group. So we look at immigrants who came to the country before they were 16 and within a particular time range. There are ways in which one can, for larger census data sets in particular, can proxy undocumented status based on whether they use government services or not, and based on their revenue. And so it's a whole algorithm. But I will say that for our survey, we felt strongly about not discouraging folks. We are, again, at a university and are not selling these data and promise confidentiality and anonymity, but we don't explicitly ask about legal status.
Understood. Thank you so much. So I know we are out of time. We have arrived at the 9:30 hour. Again, I just want to say thank you so much to all of our partners, all of our sponsors, our panelists, as well as Lorez and Marlene. We really appreciate this collaborative effort to highlight the economic impacts and as well as the contributions of our BIPOC businesses here within Sonoma County. Everything that we've done today will be available, so that will be distributed within the next day or so. Also, if you have any additional questions, please send those to the Economic Development Board. We will turn those over to Marlene to make sure that your questions are addressed and answered. And we just want to say thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful day. Take care.